Hello there, my sleepy hearts. Tonight, we descend into shadow, into the darkness that lives beneath Twilight's surface, where romance gives way to horror and immortality reveals its true cost. Long before sparkling skin and eternal love, there were screams in the darkness, transformations that broke minds, children who became monsters, wars that drowned entire territories in blood. So, close your eyes, my dreamers. Let the darkness settle around you like a shroud as we explore the moments too terrible to forget, where sleep and nightmare intertwine, and the true price of forever is finally revealed. The transformation from human to vampire is not a gift. It is not a gentle passage from one state of being to another, not a fade into unconsciousness followed by an awakening into power. It is torture, deliberate and absolute. 72 hours of agony so intense that those who experience it universally describe it as the worst thing that has ever happened to them, or ever could happen. It is being burned alive from the inside while remaining completely, horrifically conscious. It is dying slowly while feeling every moment of that death, every cell screaming as it's rewritten, every nerve firing at maximum intensity without relief or respite, or even a single second of mercy. The venom enters through a bite, through broken skin, through any breach in the body's defenses. Once inside, it spreads with terrible purpose. It moves through the bloodstream first, carried by the heart's frantic beating to every corner of the body. The heart doesn't know it's distributing poison. It simply does what hearts do, pumping blood, keeping the body alive, working desperately even as the venom begins its systematic destruction of everything that makes the body human. The venom doesn't simply alter cells. It obliterates them. It breaks down human tissue at the molecular level and rebuilds it into something fundamentally different, something that operates under rules that biology doesn't recognize. But the venom doesn't numb sensation during this process. It amplifies it. Every nerve ending in the body fires at once, sending signals of burning, searing pain to a brain that remains conscious throughout the entire ordeal. The person being transformed cannot escape into unconsciousness. They cannot faint from pain. They cannot achieve the mercy of oblivion. They are trapped inside their body, fully aware, feeling every second of the transformation as it crawls through their system like liquid fire. It burns through veins, through muscles, through organs, through bone. It destroys and rebuilds, over and over for 3 endless days. Carlyle Cullen's transformation in 1663 exemplifies this horror perfectly. He was 23 years old, leading a hunt through London's sewers, when a vampire attacked. He felt teeth sink into his neck, felt venom enter his bloodstream, felt the vampire drop him and flee as dawn approached. Carlyle knew immediately what was happening to him. He'd participated in enough hunts, had seen enough victims to recognize the signs of transformation. Rather than return to his father, rather than seek help that would result in his execution as a monster, he made a choice born from desperation and terror. He crawled into a cellar. He buried himself under potatoes, using their bulk to muffle the screams he knew were coming. And then he endured. 3 days, 72 hours, 4,320 minutes of unrelenting, unimaginable burning. Carlyle was a religious young man, raised by a pastor who taught that vampires were demons, soulless creatures condemned to hell. As the venom burned through his body, as the agony consumed him, Carlyle believed he was experiencing damnation itself. He believed his soul was being burned away, that he was being transformed not just physically, but spiritually into something evil and irredeemable. The physical pain was indescribable, but the spiritual terror was equally devastating. He wasn't just dying, he was becoming the very thing he'd been taught to destroy, the monster he'd hunted, the evil he'd dedicated his life to eliminating. The transformation takes 3 days because the venom must rewrite every cell in the body. It starts with the blood, with the fluid systems, spreading through arteries and veins until every drop of blood carries the venom with it. Then it moves into the organs, transforming the heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, every internal system. The heart beats faster and faster, working frantically as the venom demands more circulation, more distribution, pushing itself to the limit of human cardiac capacity. The lungs draw breath after desperate breath, hyperventilating as the body tries to process what's happening to it. But these efforts are futile. The organs are dying, being replaced by something that resembles them, but functions under entirely different principles. The venom reaches the brain last, or perhaps it simply takes longest to fully transform the most complex organ in the body. During this phase, the person experiences something beyond pain, beyond description. They feel their thoughts changing, feel their perceptions shifting, feel their very consciousness being altered at its foundation. Memories remain accessible, but they begin to feel distant, less important than the overwhelming sensations of transformation. The person they were is slipping away, being consumed by the fire, replaced by something new and terrible. When the transformation is complete, when every cell has been rewritten and replaced, the body undergoes its final changes. The heart, having worked frantically for 3 days to distribute the venom, finally stops. It simply ceases beating, no longer needed in the body, that no longer requires circulation of blood. The lungs take their last breath, expanding once more before going still, unnecessary for a being that doesn't need oxygen to survive. The body temperature drops, the warmth of mammalian life replaced by the cool stone temperature of vampire flesh, and the person wakes to their new existence, transformed completely, every trace of their humanity burned away and replaced with something immortal and monstrous. Rosalie Hale's transformation in 1933 carried additional horror beyond the physical agony. She had been brutally assaulted, beaten and violated by her fiancé and his friends. Left dying in the street, Carlyle found her, saw her suffering, and made a choice he's questioned ever since. He transformed her to save her life, carrying her through the city carefully so as not to spill a single drop of her blood, taking her to his home and beginning the process that would turn her into a vampire. Rosalie woke from 3 days of burning agony, from 3 days of dying and being reborn, to discover what had been done to her. She had not consented to this transformation. She had been dying, yes, but she had not asked to be saved in this way. Carlyle had made the choice for her, had decided that existence as a vampire was preferable to death, had condemned her to immortality without her permission. Rosalie woke to find herself transformed into the very beauty that had made her a target for violence in her human life, that beauty now perfected and immortalized. She had vampire strength, vampire speed, vampire senses, but she hadn't wanted any of it. She had wanted marriage, children, a normal human life. The transformation had saved her from death, but had stolen everything she'd dreamed of having. The psychological trauma of unwanted transformation is its own unique horror. Bella Swan chose her transformation, prepared for it, welcomed it as the price of spending eternity with Edward. But most vampires don't choose. Most are dying, transformed in the moment before death claims them, given no opportunity to consent or refuse. They wake to find themselves fundamentally changed, given powers they didn't ask for, burdened with a thirst they never wanted, trapped in immortality that stretches ahead without end. Some, like Rosalie, resent their transformation despite understanding that the alternative was death. Others, like Carlyle in his early years, are so horrified by what they become that they seek destruction, attempting suicide repeatedly despite the impossibility of vampire death through conventional means. Carlyle's suicide attempts after his transformation demonstrate the psychological devastation that can accompany the physical transformation. He believed he was damned, that his soul was lost, that he had become evil incarnate. He threw himself off cliffs, hoping the fall would destroy him, only to discover that vampire bodies are too durable to be killed by impact. He drowned himself, staying underwater for days, learning that vampires don't need to breathe. He tried to starve himself, refusing to drink blood, hoping that deprivation would end his existence. The thirst grew unbearable, a burning in his throat that consumed all thought. But it didn't kill him. Nothing killed him. He was trapped in immortality, unable to die, no matter how desperately he wanted to, forced to exist as the very thing he'd been taught was irredeemably evil. The first kill after transformation is its own particular darkness. Most newborns wake from their 3 days of agony consumed by an overwhelming thirst. The burning in their throat is all-consuming, demanding satisfaction, drowning out reason and morality in self-control. When they catch the scent of human blood, when prey comes near, they attack with vampire speed and vampire strength, killing messily and brutally, satisfying the thirst with desperate urgency. Only after feeding, only after the thirst is temporarily quenched, does awareness return. Only then do they remember what they've done, realize that they've killed, understand that the blood on their hands and face and clothes came from a person who was alive moments ago and is now dead because of them. Edward Cullen's first kills came not in his newborn period, but during his rebellious phase in the 1920s. He'd maintained control for his first 10 years as a vampire, drinking only animal blood as Carlyle taught. But in 1920, he left Carlyle to hunt humans, convincing himself he could make his killing moral by targeting only criminals. He used his telepathy to read thoughts, to identify murderers and rapists and abusers, to confirm their guilt before he killed them. For 10 years, he hunted humans, drank their blood, and told himself he was different from other vampires, that his killing was justified because his victims deserved death. But the horror of these kills haunted him. Edward didn't simply identify criminals and kill them quickly. He read their minds, saw their thoughts, understood them as people rather than abstract concepts of evil. He saw their regrets, their rationalizations, their humanity existing alongside their crimes, and he killed them anyway, drank their blood, satisfied his thirst with lives he decided weren't worth preserving. The telepathy that allowed him to identify criminals also forced him to know them intimately, to experience their fear as he hunted them, to hear their final thoughts as he killed them. And vampire memory is perfect. Edward remembers every victim with crystalline clarity. Every face, every thought, every death is preserved forever in his mind, impossible to forget or diminish with time. Eventually, Edward recognized what he'd become. His justifications crumbled. He saw himself as no better than the criminals he hunted, perhaps worse because he killed from choice rather than passion or desperation. He returned to Carlisle broken and disgusted by what he'd done, resuming the vegetarian lifestyle, drinking only animal blood. But the memories remained. The perfect clarity of vampire memory meant that his decade of killing would never fade, never become less vivid, never allow him peace. He carried the weight of those deaths into his relationship with Bella, saw himself as a monster pretending to be civilized, believed himself damned and soulless, despite Carlisle's insistence that vampires retain their souls and moral capacity. The transformation creates a being who remembers being human, but can never return to humanity. The vampire retains their personality, their values, their sense of self, but they're burdened with vampire thirst, with the overwhelming drive to kill that defines their new nature. They must choose every moment of every day whether to give in to that drive or resist it. For vampires like the Cullens, who choose to drink only animal blood, this choice is constant and exhausting. They remember what human blood tastes like, know how completely it satisfies the thirst in ways that animal blood never can. They're constantly denying themselves, constantly fighting their nature, constantly struggling against the most fundamental drive of their existence. Bella's transformation was unusual in that she'd prepared for it, chosen it, welcomed it. But even she, with all her mental preparation, with all her understanding of what was coming, found the 3 days of transformation to be unendurable agony. Edward transformed her by injecting venom directly into her heart, flooding her system to save her life after Renesmee's violent birth. Bella felt the venom spread through her body like liquid fire, felt it burn through every vein, every organ, every cell. She felt her heart beat faster and faster, felt it race toward its final beats, felt it stop. She felt her lungs draw their last breath. She felt herself die and be reborn into something fundamentally different. When she woke, the physical pain was gone, replaced by overwhelming thirst and supernatural senses. But the memory of the transformation remained perfectly clear, preserved in the crystalline clarity of vampire memory. She would never forget those 3 days of burning, would carry that experience forward into her immortality. The transformation that gave her eternity with Edward also gave her permanent memory of the worst pain imaginable. 3 days that would remain as vivid a century later as they were the moment they happened. This is the darkness at the foundation of vampire existence. Before the power, before the immortality, before the supernatural abilities, there is the transformation. There is the agony of dying slowly over 3 days while remaining conscious. There is the horror of waking to discover what you've become. There is the first kill, the first realization that your survival depends on death, that you become a predator designed to hunt the very species you used to belong to. And there is the perfect memory that ensures you'll never forget a single moment of it. Never be granted the mercy of fading recollection. Never escape the knowledge of what was done to you and what you must do to continue existing. The transformation is not a gift. It is trauma, deliberate and inescapable, the price paid for immortality. And every vampire carries that trauma forward into eternity, bearing the memory of their 3 days of burning as the foundation of everything they become. In the long history of vampire lore, in the thousands of years of rules and edicts and prohibitions that govern vampire society, there is no law more absolute than the one forbidding immortal children. There are no exceptions to this law, no circumstances that justify breaking it, no mercy granted to those who violate it. When the Volturi discover an immortal child, they destroy it immediately and completely. They destroy everyone who knew about it. They destroy the creators, the witnesses, anyone who helped hide it or failed to report it. They show no hesitation, no compassion, no willingness to consider intent or ignorance. The law is absolute because the consequences of breaking it are catastrophic, because immortal children represent a threat so severe that even the Volturi, who tolerate many forms of vampire behavior, can allow them to exist. An immortal child is a human child, usually a toddler or young child, who has been transformed into a vampire. Throughout vampire history, these creations were disturbingly common. Vampires would encounter human children and find them beautiful, innocent, precious. They would want to preserve that beauty forever, to create an eternal child who would remain young and loving throughout immortality. Some vampires wanted children of their own, believing that transforming a human child would give them the family they desired. Others simply found children aesthetically pleasing, viewing them as living art to be perfected through transformation. The motivations varied, but the outcome was always, inevitably, catastrophically the same. The Denali sisters created an immortal child over 1,000 years ago, during the medieval period when vampire society was less structured and the Volturi's laws were still being established and enforced. The sisters were ancient even then, transformed centuries earlier, living as typical vampires of their era. They hunted humans without particular thought or remorse, moved through human populations feeding as they needed, existing as predators in a world that hadn't yet developed the means to threaten them. They encountered a human child, a little girl, no more than 3 years old, and something about her called to them. Perhaps she was extraordinarily beautiful. Perhaps she was kind or clever, or reminded them of something from their own human lives. Lives they'd lived so long ago that memories had faded to impressions. Whatever the reason, they made a choice that would haunt them for the next millennium. They transformed her. They held her down as she screamed, as the venom entered her small body and began its work. They watched her endure 3 days of agony, this tiny child burning from the inside, experiencing pain that would break an adult's mind. They believed, perhaps, that the suffering would be worth it, that the child would emerge from transformation as a daughter they could love forever. an eternal companion who would bring joy to their immortal existence. When she woke, when the transformation was complete, she appeared to be everything they'd hoped for. She was beautiful beyond measure, her childish features perfected by the venom, her appearance frozen at the age of 3. She was affectionate, climbing into their laps, wrapping small arms around their necks, displaying all the loving behaviors of a well-cared-for toddler. She laughed, she played, she seemed happy. But immortal children are not human children preserved. They are vampire children, possessing vampire strength and vampire thirst in a body and mind frozen at an age before self-control develops, before abstract reasoning emerges, before the capacity for learning from consequences exists. A 3-year-old human child cannot understand complex cause and effect. They cannot grasp abstract concepts like restraint or hiding, or the need for secrecy. They operate on impulse, on immediate desires, on the most basic emotional responses. A 3-year-old vampire is no different in mental capacity. The transformation freezes the body and mind at the moment of change. The child doesn't grow, doesn't develop, doesn't mature beyond the cognitive level they possessed as a human. They remain 3 years old forever, trapped in a developmental stage that cannot handle the power and needs of vampire existence. When the immortal child grew thirsty, she fed. The burning in her throat demanded satisfaction, and she had no capacity to resist it, no understanding that resistance was even possible. When humans were nearby, she attacked them with vampire speed and vampire strength. A 3-year-old vampire is as strong as any other vampire, as fast, as deadly. The child could tear through adults like paper, could kill a dozen people in seconds, could slaughter entire families without effort or comprehension. And she did. She killed because she was thirsty, because prey was available, because nothing in her limited cognitive development suggested she shouldn't. She didn't understand that the people she killed were alive, that they felt pain, that they had families and lives that ended when she ended them. Death was abstract to her, meaningless, no more significant than breaking a toy. The Denali sisters tried desperately to control her, to teach her limits, to explain why she couldn't simply kill anyone she wanted. They used simple language, the kind one uses with toddlers. They demonstrated, they rewarded good behavior. They tried every technique they could imagine for teaching a young child. But teaching requires the student's capacity to learn, and a 3-year-old mind cannot grasp the concepts necessary for vampire survival. She might understand simple commands in the moment. Don't hurt that person, stay here, be quiet. But as soon as she was thirsty or frightened or simply curious, all teaching evaporated. She acted on impulse because impulse was all she had. The sisters couldn't be with her every moment, couldn't prevent every attack, couldn't stop her from killing. The deaths mounted with horrifying speed. Entire villages disappeared, populations slaughtered by a child who didn't comprehend what she was doing. The sisters followed her trail of destruction, trying to clean up evidence, trying to limit the exposure, trying desperately to manage the catastrophe they'd created, but they couldn't be everywhere. They couldn't undo the deaths. They couldn't make the patterns disappear. Hundreds of people died at the hands of their immortal child. Hundreds of lives ended because the sisters had wanted an eternal daughter and hadn't understood the consequences of that desire. The child would kill, would be covered in blood and gore, and then would turn to her mothers with a smile, seeking affection, wanting to be held, displaying love and innocence moments after committing slaughter. This was the true horror of immortal children. They weren't evil, they weren't malicious, they were simply children, operating at a child's cognitive level, incapable of understanding the magnitude of what they did. The immortal child loved her mothers genuinely and completely. She wanted their approval, their affection, their attention. But she also killed without restraint because she couldn't understand why she shouldn't, because her mind was frozen at an age before moral reasoning develops. The combination of childish love and uncontrolled violence created something uniquely terrible, a being that inspired protective instincts in its creators, even as it destroyed everything around it. The patterns of death inevitably drew attention. Humans noticed entire communities disappearing, noticed the bodies, noticed that something was hunting them. In the medieval period, supernatural explanations were readily accepted. People believed in monsters, in demons, in evil that walked in the darkness. The disappearances and deaths created terror, created legends, created exactly the kind of attention that threatened all vampires. The Volturi, who were establishing their rule and enforcing their secrecy law, took notice. They investigated the patterns, tracked the deaths back to their source, and discovered the immortal child and her creators. The Volturi's arrival was swift and merciless. They came with their guard, with Jane and Alec and the others who made them nearly invincible. They examined the situation, confirmed what the child was, and pronounced judgment immediately. The immortal child would be destroyed. This was not negotiable, not subject to appeal or mercy. The child was a violation of the most serious law, a threat to all vampires through the exposure she created. She had to die. The only question was whether the Denali sisters would die with her. The standard punishment for creating an immortal child was destruction of both child and creators. The Volturi didn't forgive this violation because the consequences were too severe. The threat to vampire secrecy, too extreme. Creating an immortal child demonstrated either stunning ignorance of vampire law or willful disregard for it, and neither was acceptable. But the Denali sisters had a defense that saved them. Barely. They genuinely hadn't known about the prohibition. They were ancient vampires, yes, but they'd been transformed before the Volturi established this particular law, before the catastrophes caused by immortal children had led to the absolute ban. They hadn't understood the consequences of their creation until those consequences manifested in hundreds of deaths. Their grief convinced the Volturi to spare them. When the guards seized their daughter, when they held her for execution, the sisters' devastation was absolute and genuine. They weren't pretending, weren't performing. They loved this child despite what she'd done, despite the death she'd caused, despite the catastrophe she represented. They begged for mercy, for another chance, for any alternative to watching their daughter destroyed. But there was no alternative. The law was absolute. The Volturi refused their pleas, and the sisters were forced to watch as the guard tore their child apart and burned her remains. The immortal child didn't understand what was happening. She fought because she was being hurt, screamed because she was frightened, reached for her mothers as the guard pulled her away. Her last sounds were cries for help, for her mothers to save her, confused and terrified calls from a 3-year-old who couldn't comprehend why the people she loved weren't protecting her. The sisters heard every scream. They watched the flames consume her body, watched the smoke rise, watched their daughter reduced to ash that scattered in the wind. The trauma of that moment, the sight and sound of their child being destroyed, broke something in them that has never fully healed even after 1,000 years. The Volturi spared the sisters, perhaps moved by their grief, perhaps satisfied that punishment had already been inflicted, perhaps simply recognizing that they genuinely hadn't known the law they were breaking. But survival without their daughter, survival with the knowledge of what they'd done, was its own form of torture. The sisters were left alive to carry the memory of every person their child had killed, to remember the hundreds of deaths that resulted from their choice to create her, to know that their desire for an eternal daughter had led to catastrophe, and ultimately to their daughter's destruction. The guilt was crushing, overwhelming, a weight that made their continued existence almost unbearable. In their grief and self-hatred, the sisters sought Carlisle Cullen. They'd heard of him through vampire information networks, heard of the strange vampire who refused to kill humans, who sustained himself on animal blood. The concept seemed impossible, but in their desperation for some form of atonement, they needed to try. They couldn't undo what they'd done. They couldn't bring back their daughter or the hundreds of people she'd killed, but perhaps they could stop adding to the death count. Perhaps by adopting Carlisle's lifestyle, by refusing to kill humans, they could create some small balance against the deaths their immortal child had caused. Carlisle welcomed them without judgment. He taught them his methods, supported them through the difficult transition to animal blood, helped them maintain control when human scent threatened to overwhelm their resolve. The vegetarian lifestyle was harder for them than it had been for Carlisle. He'd adopted it from philosophical conviction, from belief that killing humans was wrong. The sisters adopted it from trauma, from desperate need to atone rather than genuine philosophical commitment. They didn't necessarily believe vampire predation was morally wrong in abstract terms. They simply couldn't bear to kill humans anymore, couldn't add to the deaths their child had caused, couldn't participate in taking human life after witnessing the consequences of uncontrolled killing. For over 1,000 years, the Denali sisters maintained this lifestyle. They drank only animal blood, lived quietly, avoided drawing attention. They settled eventually in Alaska, in vast wilderness far from human populations, where they could exist without constant temptation. The vegetarian lifestyle was penance, conscious and deliberate. A daily choice to value human life because they had seen the cost of treating it as worthless. They never forgot their immortal child. They never stopped carrying the guilt of creating her and the trauma of watching her burn. The memory remained as fresh after centuries as it had been the day it happened, preserved in the perfect clarity of vampire memory. But the tragedy that defined the Denali sisters' existence would reach forward through centuries to create new pain. Irina, the youngest of the three sisters, struggled most with the trauma. She'd been closest to the child, had perhaps loved her most intensely, had carried the deepest guilt for the deaths. In the early 2000s, over 1,000 years after the immortal child's destruction, Irina formed a relationship with Laurent, a nomadic vampire attempting to join the Denali coven. When Laurent was killed by the Quileute shapeshifters, Irina's grief reopened the old wounds. She was consumed by loss, by rage, by the pain of watching another person she loved being destroyed. Then Irina saw Renesmee Cullen from a distance in the forest near Forks. She saw what appeared to be a child vampire, a little girl with impossible beauty and supernatural grace. The sight triggered every trauma from the immortal child incident. Irina, still grieving Laurent, still consumed by pain, made a terrible decision born from that pain. She reported what she'd seen to the Volturi, claiming the Cullens had created an immortal child, breaking the most serious vampire law. She believed she was doing the right thing, preventing the tragedy she'd experienced from happening again, protecting others from the deaths that an immortal child would inevitably cause. The Volturi came in force, bringing their entire guard, prepared to destroy the immortal child and probably the Cullens with it. They arrived expecting validation of Irina's report, expecting to find an illegal creation that would justify their attack. Instead, they found Renesmee, who was not an immortal child, but a hybrid, half vampire and half human, capable of growth and development in ways that immortal children never could. The distinction was crucial. The law prohibited immortal children specifically because they couldn't control themselves, couldn't learn, couldn't develop beyond their frozen age. Renesmee could do all of these things. She wasn't the threat that immortal children represented. When Irina realized her mistake, when she understood that she brought the Volturi down on the Cullens over a child who wasn't actually illegal, her horror was absolute. She'd acted from trauma and grief, had made assumptions without verifying, had potentially caused the destruction of an entire coven, including her own sisters, who had come to stand with the Cullens. But the Volturi, frustrated that their pretext for confronting the Cullens had evaporated, needed to save face. They'd come in full force, had made accusations, had gathered their strength for battle. Caius argued for Irina's destruction as punishment for bearing false witness, and Aro agreed. Tanya and Kate were forced to watch as the Volturi destroyed their youngest sister. They stood in the snow, held back by Garrett and Carlyle, and their own knowledge that intervening would mean their own destruction, and witnessed Irina torn apart and burned. The parallel to their immortal child's destruction 1,000 years earlier was devastating. They'd lost a daughter to the Volturi once, watched flames consume someone they loved, carried that trauma for a millennium. Now they watched it happen again. Their youngest sister reduced to ash, destroyed for a mistake born from the very trauma the Volturi had caused in the first place. The law against immortal children exists because immortal children represent an existential threat to all vampires. They cannot be controlled, they cannot be taught. They will inevitably create patterns of death that threaten exposure. The Volturi enforce this law without exception because they believe even one immortal child allowed to exist could expose the vampire world and bring human retaliation down on all their kind. The law is absolute because the consequences of breaking it are catastrophic, but the enforcement of that law has created its own catastrophes, its own trail of destroyed children and traumatized families, its own legacy of grief that echoes through centuries. In the 1860s, in the territories of Mexico and the American South, vampires discovered something that would transform vampire warfare and create one of the darkest periods in their hidden history. They discovered that newborn vampires, despite their lack of experience and control, possess strength that even ancient vampires could not match. A vampire fresh from transformation, still wild with thirst and instinct, could tear apart a vampire who had existed for centuries. This temporary surge of power lasted approximately 1 year, fading gradually as the last traces of human blood were consumed and replaced entirely by vampire physiology. But during that year, newborns were weapons of extraordinary effectiveness, stronger and faster in raw physical confrontation than any older vampire could be through skill or experience alone. Ambitious vampires throughout Mexico and the southern United States began creating newborns specifically to use as soldiers. They transformed humans not to save them from death, not to create companions or family, but to build armies. These newborns were weapons, nothing more, created to fight in territorial wars over hunting grounds and dominance. The practice spread rapidly as vampire warlords realized the tactical advantage the newborn armies provided. If your enemy had 10 experienced vampires, you could overwhelm them with 20 newborns. If your newborn army was destroyed, you simply created more, transforming another wave of humans to replace your casualties. The wars escalated quickly, vampires competing to create larger and larger forces, transforming hundreds of humans into disposable soldiers. Maria was one of the most successful of these vampire warlords, ruling territory in Mexico through calculated violence and strategic use of newborn armies. She understood that newborns were powerful but difficult to control, that their wild nature made them as dangerous to their creators as to their enemies. She needed someone who could manage them, who could keep them controlled enough to be useful while maintaining their aggressive edge for battle. In 1863, during the chaos of the American Civil War, she encountered Jasper Whitlock, a young Confederate soldier, and recognized something in him that suggested he would be valuable. She transformed him, and when he woke, she discovered he possessed a gift that made him perfect for her purposes. Jasper could feel and manipulate the emotions of those around him. He could sense fear, anger, aggression, calm, any emotional state in humans or vampires. More importantly, he could change those emotions, could flood someone with calm or rage, could manipulate their emotional state with precision. Maria immediately saw how useful this gift would be for controlling newborn armies. Jasper could keep the newborns calm enough to follow orders, could make them aggressive during battle, could manage their volatile emotions in ways that would be impossible through normal methods of control. She put him in charge of her newborn forces, made him responsible for creating, training, and managing the soldiers she used to expand and defend her territory. For decades, Jasper created newborns. He would select humans, usually young men who appeared strong and aggressive, people whose human traits suggested they would make effective soldiers. He would transform them, watch them endure the 3 days of burning agony, then begin training them the moment they woke. The training was minimal, just enough to make them useful in battle. He taught them to fight, to follow basic commands, to channel their aggression toward enemies rather than toward each other or toward Maria. He used his gift constantly, manipulating their emotions to keep them manageable, flooding them with calm when they became too violent, inducing aggression when battle approached. The newborns were kept in a constant state of barely controlled chaos. They fought each other constantly, establishing dominance hierarchies, working out their aggression on whoever was nearest. Jasper had to manage these conflicts, had to prevent the newborns from destroying each other before they could be useful in battle. He became expert at vampire combat through sheer necessity, learning to fight multiple opponents simultaneously, developing strategies for controlling stronger but less skilled adversaries. His body accumulated scars, bite marks that remained visible even after transformation, permanent evidence of the countless times newborns had attacked him. Every scar represented a moment when a newborn had lost control, when Jasper had been forced to fight to maintain his authority, when teeth had broken through his stone skin and left permanent marks. The battles themselves were brutal and chaotic. Newborn armies would clash in the darkness, dozens or hundreds of vampires fighting simultaneously, tearing each other apart with savage efficiency. The fighting was not elegant or strategic in any sophisticated sense. It was raw violence, overwhelming force, newborns using their superior strength to destroy older vampires who couldn't match their physical power. The casualties were enormous. Newborns died by the dozens in each battle, torn apart by enemy forces, their remains burned to ensure they couldn't regenerate. The ground would be littered with pieces of vampires, limbs torn from bodies, fragments that had to be collected and burned to prevent any possibility of regeneration. Maria would simply create more, transforming new humans to replace the losses, maintaining her army's strength through constant recruitment and replacement. Jasper's role extended beyond training and battle management. He also had to destroy newborns when they outlived their usefulness. After approximately 1 year, newborn strength faded to normal vampire levels. These older newborns became less valuable as soldiers, no longer possessing the overwhelming physical advantage that made them effective weapons. Maria didn't keep them. She had Jasper destroy them, culling the army regularly to maintain its fighting effectiveness. Jasper would select the newborns whose strength had faded, would execute them efficiently, would burn their remains, then would help Maria create new newborns to replace them, continuing the cycle of creation and destruction. This cycle continued for decades. Jasper created hundreds of newborns during his time with Maria. He trained them, fought alongside them, managed their violent natures, then destroyed them when they were no longer useful. His gift made him feel every emotion, every fear and pain and rage of everyone around him. He felt the newborn's terror during transformation, their confusion when they woke, their aggression during training, their fear during battle, their panic when they realized they were about to be destroyed. The accumulated emotional weight of this constant creation and destruction was crushing, a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. But Jasper had no escape. Maria valued him too highly to let him leave. He was essential to her operation, the only reason she could maintain control over her newborn forces. She used their relationship, the bond between creator and created vampire, to keep him loyal. She manipulated him emotionally, made him believe he was important to her beyond his usefulness, that their partnership was something more than simply strategic. Jasper, young in vampire terms and lacking experience with vampire relationships, believed her for years. He continued creating and destroying newborns, continued managing Maria's wars, continued accumulating trauma, even as he excelled at the role she'd given him. The Southern Vampire Wars created carnage on a scale that threatened the fundamental secrecy of vampire existence. Thousands of humans disappeared, transformed into newborns, or killed to feed the armies. Entire communities were depopulated. The patterns of death and disappearance were impossible to hide completely. Legends grew among human populations, stories of monsters and demons that hunted in the darkness. Humans in affected areas began traveling in groups, arming themselves, avoiding the night. The situation drew closer and closer to exposure, to organized human resistance, to the kind of attention that could threaten all vampires everywhere. The human cost of the Southern Wars extended beyond those transformed or killed directly. Families lost sons and daughters who simply disappeared, taken in the night to be transformed into newborn soldiers. Communities collapsed as their populations dwindled. Economic activity ceased in areas where the wars were most intense, as humans fled or died or were transformed. The social fabric of entire regions was destroyed by vampire conflicts that the human victims couldn't even see clearly, couldn't understand, couldn't fight effectively. They knew something was hunting them. New people were disappearing, but they couldn't comprehend the scale or nature of the threat. The Volturi eventually intervened. They sent delegations to Mexico and the southern United States with clear instructions. The newborn armies must be destroyed, and the practice of creating them must stop. The Volturi didn't object to vampires fighting each other. They didn't care about territorial disputes or power struggles among vampires. But the scale of the Southern Wars, the thousands of transformations, the patterns of death that threatened exposure, all of this violated the Volturi's most fundamental law. Vampires must remain hidden from human awareness. The Southern Wars risked revealing vampire existence to the human world, and that was unacceptable. The Volturi's response was characteristically brutal. They destroyed newborn armies wholesale, burning hundreds of newborn vampires. They executed the vampire warlords who had created the armies, making examples of the most flagrant violators. They made clear that large-scale newborn creation would not be tolerated, that any vampire-creating armies would face destruction. The message was unambiguous and backed by overwhelming force. The Volturi possessed gifts that made them nearly invincible, and they used those gifts to crush the Southern Wars decisively. Jane's pain illusions incapacitated entire groups of newborns simultaneously. Alec's sensory deprivation left them helpless. The executions were swift and absolute. Maria survived the purge because she was more careful than her rivals. She kept her army smaller, better controlled. Jasper's gift allowed her to manage newborns more effectively than other warlords could, which meant she needed fewer of them to maintain her power. She avoided the excessive brutality that drew the most Volturi attention. When the purges came, when other warlords were destroyed, Maria adapted. She reduced her newborn creation to sustainable levels, maintained just enough force to defend her territory, but not enough to threaten the secrecy law. She survived by being pragmatic, by recognizing that the old ways were no longer tenable. But Jasper's trauma from the wars didn't end with the Volturi's intervention. He continued serving Maria, continued creating and destroying newborns, though in smaller numbers. The emotional weight continued accumulating. His gift, which Maria had found so useful, became a curse. He felt everything. Every newborn's fear, every victim's terror, every death's emotional resonance flowed through him constantly. He tried to numb himself, tried to build emotional walls, tried to find some way to endure the constant bombardment of others' feelings. Nothing worked. The empathy was absolute, involuntary, inescapable. The psychological burden of feeling every emotion while causing so much death created a form of torture unique to Jasper's existence. Other vampires who killed could distance themselves emotionally from their victims. Jasper couldn't. When he destroyed a newborn whose usefulness had ended, he felt that newborn's fear and confusion and desperate desire to live. When the armies fought and newborns died screaming, he felt their agony and terror. When he created new newborns, transforming humans into weapons, he felt their pain during the 3-day transformation and their disorientation when they woke. The gift that made him valuable to Maria also ensured he could never escape the emotional reality of what he was doing. The specific memories that haunted Jasper were countless, preserved in perfect vampire clarity. He remembered individual newborns, their faces when he selected them for transformation, their confusion when they woke, their growing skill as he trained them, their fear when he decided their usefulness had ended. He remembered battles, the chaos and violence, the emotional storm of dozens of vampires fighting and dying simultaneously. He remembered the moments when he had to destroy newborns who had trusted him, who had followed his orders, who had believed he valued them. The betrayal inherent in that dynamic, creating soldiers and then destroying them when they were no longer useful, weighed on him with particular heaviness. Eventually, Jasper recognized that he couldn't continue. The accumulation of trauma, the weight of hundreds of deaths he'd caused, the emotional burden of his gift, all of it became unbearable. He left Maria, walking away from her service despite the risks. She could have hunted him, could have destroyed him for defecting, but perhaps she recognized that he was broken, that continuing to use him would break him completely. Or perhaps she'd found someone else with useful gifts to replace him. Whatever her reasoning, she let him go. Jasper wandered for years after leaving Maria, miserable and alone, carrying the weight of what he'd done. He'd been a soldier in the Civil War, had believed he was fighting for something meaningful. Then he'd become a soldier in vampire wars, creating and destroying for territory and power. He'd killed so many. He'd felt their deaths. He remembered everything with perfect vampire clarity. The Southern Wars had marked him permanently, both physically through the scars that covered his body and psychologically through trauma that would never fully heal. When Alice found him in a diner in 1948, when she showed him her vision of a family that lived differently, that didn't kill humans, that chose compassion over violence, Jasper could barely believe such a thing was possible. After his century of darkness, after the wars and the deaths and the emotional torture, the idea that vampires could choose peace seemed like a fantasy. But Alice was certain, and her certainty gave him hope. She'd seen him coming, had waited for him, knew exactly when and where he would arrive. Her faith in him, her absolute conviction that he could be something other than a weapon, gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He followed her to the Cullens, adopted their vegetarian lifestyle, tried to become something other than the weapon he'd been. The transition was extraordinarily difficult. After decades of human blood, after the wars and the constant violence, learning to resist his nature required strength Jasper didn't know he possessed. His gift made the struggle harder. He felt the Cullens' trust, their acceptance, their belief in him. He also felt their occasional fear when he struggled with control, their concern when human scent threatened to overwhelm him. Every emotion around him was amplified, making the already difficult task of resisting human blood even more challenging. But he tried, because Alice believed in him, because the Cullens accepted him, despite knowing what he'd done, because the alternative was returning to the darkness he'd finally escaped. The Southern Wars had taken decades of his existence and left him scarred and traumatized. The Cullens offered him a chance at something different, at peace instead of violence, at family instead of isolation. Jasper took that chance, held on to it desperately, and slowly began to believe that even a vampire who had caused so much death could choose to stop killing, could find meaning in existence beyond warfare, could become something more than the sum of his darkest moments. James was a tracker, a vampire whose gift allowed him to hunt anyone, anywhere, with a precision and persistence that made escape nearly impossible. His ability wasn't simply enhanced senses or superior speed, though he possessed both. It was an intuitive understanding of his prey, a supernatural instinct that allowed him to predict their movements, to know where they would run before they ran, to feel the connection between hunter and hunted as a physical pull. Once James decided to hunt someone, that person became his obsession, his singular focus, the only thing that mattered in his existence. He would follow them across continents if necessary, would wait months or years if required, would use any method available to achieve the kill. The hunt itself was what James lived for, not the feeding that came after, not the satisfaction of thirst. The chase, the pursuit, the psychological torture of knowing his prey was running while understanding they could never truly escape. This was what gave his immortal existence meaning. James had hunted for over 300 years when he encountered the Cullens in Forks. He'd killed hundreds, perhaps thousands of victims during that time. Most were humans, easy prey whose deaths meant nothing to him beyond momentary satisfaction. But occasionally James would encounter prey that posed a challenge, that required real effort to capture. These were the hunts he treasured, the ones he remembered with pleasure, the kills that stood out across centuries of predation. He documented his favorite hunts on video, recording the final moments, preserving the fear and desperation of particularly challenging prey. These recordings were trophies, evidence of his skill, memories he could revisit whenever he wanted, to relive the thrill of a successful hunt. Victoria and Laurent traveled with James not because they were a true coven, but because the alliance provided mutual benefit. Victoria possessed a gift for self-preservation, an intuitive sense of danger that allowed her to evade threats and find escape routes. Laurent had no particular gift, but was strong and experienced enough to be useful in conflicts. The three of them moved through the world as nomadic vampires, hunting humans, avoiding attention, creating no permanent ties or commitments. They were together because traveling in a group provided advantages, not because they shared values or genuine affection. Or so it seemed until James's death revealed that he and Victoria were mates, bound by the supernatural connection that made their relationship fundamentally different from simple companionship. When James encountered Bella Swan, when he called her scent during the baseball game in Forks, everything changed. Bella was human, fragile, completely vulnerable by any objective measure. But she was protected by an entire coven of vampires, by the Cullens who had chosen to value her life above their own interests. This protection transformed Bella from easy prey into a genuine challenge. James's predatory instincts awakened fully. He became obsessed, fixated on hunting Bella, not because her blood called to him particularly strongly, but because the Cullens had dared to protect her, because she represented a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be overcome. The Cullens understood immediately that James would not simply lose interest and move on. His reputation as a tracker preceded him. Vampires throughout the world knew James, knew his gifts, knew that once he decided to hunt someone, that person's death was essentially inevitable. The Cullens' only hope was to hide Bella effectively enough and for long enough that James might give up, might decide the hunt wasn't worth the effort. They split up, creating false trails, using Alice's visions to anticipate James's movements, protecting Bella with everything they had. But James was patient. He'd hunted for centuries. He knew how to wait, how to watch, how to find weaknesses in his prey's defenses. James's strategy for capturing Bella demonstrated his understanding of human psychology and his willingness to use psychological torture as a hunting tool. He couldn't get to Bella directly. The Cullens kept her too well protected, moved her too frequently, anticipated his approaches before he could execute them. So James stopped trying to attack Bella directly and started attacking her emotional vulnerabilities instead. He researched her history, learned about her mother Renee, discovered where Renee lived. Then he created a trap that exploited Bella's love for her mother and her tendency to sacrifice herself for those she cared about. James captured Renee and used her as bait. He called Bella's mother's phone, allowed Bella to hear what she believed was her mother in distress, in danger, calling for help. Bella's response was exactly what James predicted. She would sacrifice herself to save her mother. She would walk into an obvious trap if it meant protecting someone she loved. This wasn't stupidity on Bella's part. It was the inevitable response of someone who valued others' lives above her own survival. James understood this about her, recognized the emotional weakness he could exploit, and used it with calculated precision. The ballet studio where James lured Bella was chosen deliberately. It was familiar to her, a place from her childhood where she'd taken dance lessons, somewhere that carried emotional weight and memory. James wanted her off balance, wanted her in a location that would confuse her emotionally while he hunted her. When Bella arrived, when she walked into the studio believing she was saving her mother, James was waiting. He'd already recorded video of Renee, had created the illusion of her presence and danger. But Renee was never there. James had used recorded footage, manipulation, psychological warfare. Bella walked into the trap alone, without the Cullens' protection, exactly as James had planned. James's pleasure in the successful hunt was evident in everything he did after Bella arrived. He didn't kill her immediately. He talked to her, explained how he trapped her, detailed the cleverness of his strategy. He wanted her to understand how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered, wanted her to feel the despair of recognizing that escape was impossible. He set up his video camera, positioning it carefully to capture what would happen next. This recording would be his trophy, evidence of a particularly satisfying hunt, something he could share with Victoria and watch later to relive the moment. The attack, when it came, was brutal and methodical. James threw Bella across the room, her human fragility making her easy to hurt. She crashed into mirrors, glass shattering around her, cutting her skin, spilling blood. James could have killed her instantly, could have ended it quickly, but he prolonged it, enjoying her fear, savoring the hunt's conclusion. He broke her leg, listening to the bone snap, watching her crumple in pain. He picked her up and threw her again, treating her like a toy, demonstrating his complete control over the situation. Bella tried to fight, tried to escape, but human strength against vampire power was meaningless. She was utterly helpless. Then James bit her. He sank his teeth into her hand, injecting venom into her bloodstream, beginning the transformation that would turn her into a vampire. But this wasn't an act of creation or compassion. It was torture. James wanted her to experience the burning, wanted her to feel venom spreading through her system, wanted to watch her suffer before he killed her. The venom would make her death more painful, would ensure her final moments were agony. He held her hand to his mouth, drinking her blood, savoring the taste, while venom continued spreading through her veins, and the transformation began its terrible work. Edward arrived in time to prevent Bella's death, but not in time to prevent her suffering. He tore James away from her, threw him across the room with vampire strength. Emmett and Jasper were with him, and together they attacked James, repaying violence with violence, fury driving them to destroy the vampire who had tortured someone they considered family. The fight was savage. James was an experienced fighter, had survived 3 centuries through skill and instinct, but he was outnumbered, facing 3 vampires who fought with protective rage. They tore him apart, literally dismembered him, then burned the pieces to ensure he could never regenerate or recover. But even with James destroyed, Bella's crisis continued. The venom in her system was spreading, burning through her veins, beginning the transformation that would turn her human body into vampire flesh. Edward could smell it, could track its progress through her bloodstream, knew that if he didn't remove it, she would complete the transformation and become a vampire. Bella wanted this, had wanted to be transformed, wanted to spend eternity with Edward. But Edward didn't want to take her humanity, didn't want to condemn her to vampire existence when she was only 17, when she had so much human life still ahead of her. So Edward made a choice that required more control than perhaps anything he'd done in his century as a vampire. He put his mouth to Bella's wound, to the bite on her hand where James had injected venom, and he began to suck the venom out. He tasted her blood, the blood that called to him more strongly than any other human's, the blood he'd been resisting since the moment he met her. The venom carried her blood's flavor, intensified it, made it even more appealing than usual. Edward had to drink enough to remove the venom, but stopped before he drained her completely. Had to maintain perfect control while tasting exactly what his vampire nature craved most. The experience was agony for both of them. Bella felt the venom burning through her system, felt Edward's mouth on her wound, felt her blood being drawn out. The sensations were overwhelming: pain and burning and the strange pulling feeling of blood leaving her body. She wanted the transformation to continue, wanted to become a vampire, wanted to stay with Edward forever. But she was too weak to fight, too hurt to argue, could only lie there while Edward made the choice for her. Edward felt her blood in his mouth, tasted perfection, fought every instinct that screamed at him to drink more, to drain her, to satisfy the thirst that had tormented him since meeting her. His control was absolute but purchased at terrible cost. Every second was a battle, every swallow a victory over his nature. Carlyle helped, monitoring Bella's vital signs, telling Edward when enough venom had been removed, providing them medical expertise that allowed them to save her life. But the decision, the control, the impossible act of stopping when he could have continued drinking, all of that was Edward's. He pulled away from her wound when Carlyle told him to, when her blood was clean of venom, when the transformation had been halted before it could progress beyond reversal. Bella would live. She would remain human. Edward had saved her from James and from transformation, had protected her from death and from the immortality she claimed to want. But Victoria watched James's death on the video he'd been recording. She saw the Cullens destroy her mate, saw them tear him apart and burn the pieces. The mate bond that had connected her to James transformed in that moment from love to rage. Victoria's gift was self-preservation, an instinct that always found the path to safety. But mate bonds override survival instincts. With James dead, with the most important relationship of her existence severed, Victoria's gift turned from self-preservation to vengeance. She would kill Bella Swan. She would make the Cullens suffer as she was suffering. She would destroy Edward's mate the way he'd destroyed hers. Victoria was patient, clever, driven by grief that transformed into cold calculation. She wouldn't attack directly, wouldn't face the Cullens in open confrontation, where their numbers and gifts would overwhelm her. Instead, she would create her own army, her own force of newborn vampires, and she would send them to destroy everything the Cullens loved. The hunt James had started, the pursuit that had ended in the ballet studio, wasn't over. It had simply changed hunters, changed methods, become something larger and more terrible. James's death had ended one threat and created another, transforming Victoria from James's companion into an enemy driven by mate bond grief and supernatural rage. The ballet studio stood empty after that night. Glass scattered across the floor, blood stains that would confuse human investigators, evidence of violence that no one could quite explain. James was ash, scattered and gone. Bella survived with scars that would last until her eventual transformation. Edward carried the memory of her blood in his mouth, the taste of perfection, and the victory of having stopped before taking too much. And Victoria disappeared into the darkness, planning revenge, preparing to create an army driven by the mate bond that demanded blood for blood, death for death, suffering equal to her own. Victoria's grief transformed into something cold and methodical within hours of James's death. The mate bond that had connected her to him didn't disappear when he died. It remained, a gaping wound in her psyche, an absence where the most important presence in her existence had been. But Victoria's gift was self-preservation, an instinctive understanding of danger and escape routes that had kept her alive for centuries. That gift, combined with mate bond grief, created something uniquely dangerous. She wouldn't attack the Cullens directly. She wouldn't make the mistake James had made, underestimating their strength and unity. Instead, she would create an overwhelming force, an army large enough to destroy them through sheer numbers. And she would use that army to kill Bella, Swan, and anyone who stood in her way. Victoria began creating her newborn army in Seattle, far enough from Forks to avoid immediate Cullen attention, but close enough to strike when ready. She transformed humans systematically, choosing victims who displayed anger, aggression, violence in their human lives. These traits would translate into useful ferocity as newborns. She took young men mostly, people whose physical strength will be enhanced by transformation, people whose deaths wouldn't draw excessive attention. She moved through Seattle's darker spaces, finding victims among the homeless, the addicted, the angry, people whose disappearances would be noted but not investigated with particular urgency. But Victoria needed more than just an army. She needed a lieutenant, someone who could help her control the newborns, who could train them and manage their violent tendencies. She found Riley Beers, a college student, someone young and idealistic enough to be manipulated. She transformed him first, before the others, gave him time to gain some control over his newborn nature. Then she began the manipulation that would make him useful. She pretended to love him, created a false mate bond through lies and careful emotional manipulation. She told him he was special, that she'd chosen him specifically, that together they would create something powerful and important. Riley believed her completely. He was young, recently transformed, desperate for meaning in his new existence. Victoria's attention felt like love, like purpose, like everything he needed to make sense of what had happened to him. She told him the Cullens were evil, that they threatened all vampires, that destroying them was necessary for vampire survival. She positioned their revenge mission as righteous warfare rather than personal vendetta. Riley accepted this narrative without question, became her loyal follower, believed he was fighting for something meaningful rather than being used as a tool for someone else's revenge. Together, Victoria and Riley created an army that eventually numbered over 20 newborns. They transformed humans in waves, bringing them to a location outside Seattle where they could be contained and trained. The newborns woke confused and violent, consumed by thirst, fighting each other for dominance. Riley had to establish control through physical violence, had to prove himself stronger and more skilled, despite the newborn's superior raw strength. Victoria stayed mostly hidden, letting Riley serve as the visible leader, keeping herself safe from the newborn's unpredictable violence while maintaining ultimate control over the operation. The training Riley provided was minimal, just enough to make the newborns useful in battle. He taught them to fight in groups, to overwhelm opponents through coordinated attacks, to use their superior strength effectively. He kept them hungry, feeding them just enough to maintain functionality, but not enough to satisfy the burning thirst. Hungry newborns were more aggressive, more violent, more likely to attack with the ferocity Victoria needed. The entire operation was designed to create weapons, disposable soldiers who would destroy the Cullens or die trying. Victoria didn't care which newborn survived. She cared only that Bella Swan died and that Edward Cullen suffered the loss of his mate the way Victoria had suffered the loss of hers. But the newborns' deaths in Seattle began drawing attention. Over 20 people disappeared within months. Bodies occasionally discovered drained of blood. Patterns of violence that couldn't be explained through conventional means. The human authorities investigated, theorized about serial killers, increased police presence. The media covered the disappearances extensively, creating exactly the kind of attention that threatened vampire secrecy. The Volturi, who monitored such situations, took notice. They watched Seattle, observed the patterns, recognized a newborn army being created, but they didn't immediately intervene. They waited, curious to see what would happen. perhaps hoping the situation would give them an excuse to destroy the Cullens or acquire their gifted members. Among the newborns Victoria created was a 15-year-old girl named Bree Tanner. Bree woke from transformation confused and frightened, thrust into a house full of violent newborns who fought constantly for dominance. She learned vampire nature through observation and brutal experience. The stronger newborns controlled access to blood, to space, to anything resembling safety. Bree stayed quiet, avoided conflict, tried to understand what was happening to her. She formed a brief friendship with another newborn named Diego, someone who seemed less violent than the others, who asked questions and tried to make sense of their existence. Diego discovered that the lies Riley told them weren't entirely true. He experimented, discovered that sunlight didn't destroy vampires as Riley claimed, that many of the restrictions Riley imposed were manipulation rather than reality. Diego shared these discoveries with Bree, and together they began questioning what they'd been told. But when Diego confronted Riley with these questions, when he challenged the narrative they'd been fed, Victoria destroyed him. She killed him quietly, told Riley he'd been destroyed by the Cullens, used his death as further evidence that the Cullens were enemies who needed to be eliminated. Bree lost her only friend and learned that questioning authority in Victoria's army meant death. The Cullens discovered Victoria's plan through Alice's visions. Alice saw the newborn army coming, saw the attack being prepared, saw the danger approaching. The Cullens prepared for battle, reaching out to the Quileute shapeshifters for assistance despite the historical enmity between vampires and the wolf pack. The shapeshifters agreed because Victoria's newborn army threatened their territory and the humans they protected. The alliance was temporary, practical, built on mutual need rather than trust, but it gave the Cullens numbers and strength they would need to survive the coming attack. The Cullens also prepared by training, by developing strategies for fighting newborns, by using Jasper's experience from the southern vampire wars. Jasper knew how newborns fought, knew their strengths and weaknesses, knew how to exploit their lack of skill and experience. He taught the others, demonstrated techniques for using leverage and strategy to overcome superior strength. The training was intense, pragmatic, designed to keep them alive against overwhelming numbers. Edward stayed with Bella, keeping her hidden while the others prepared to fight, unwilling to risk her being killed if the battle went poorly. The battle occurred in a clearing near Forks, in the forest, where the Cullens could fight without human witnesses. Victoria sent her army ahead, held Riley back initially as a second wave, positioned herself where she could observe without immediate danger. The newborns attacked with the mindless aggression of newly transformed vampires, overwhelming strength without strategy or coordination. But the Cullens fought with experience and precision, working together, using the techniques Jasper taught them. The shapeshifters attacked from another direction, their massive wolf forms tearing through newborns with savage efficiency. The violence was extreme, chaotic, the forest floor becoming a battlefield littered with pieces of vampires. The Cullens and wolves dismembered newborns systematically, tearing them apart and burning the pieces to ensure they couldn't regenerate. The newborns fought back desperately, confused and frightened, following Riley's orders to attack without understanding why they were fighting or what they were supposed to accomplish. Many died within minutes, overwhelmed by opponents who were weaker individually but far more skilled and coordinated. Bree survived the initial battle by hiding, by staying away from the worst fighting, by using the survival instincts she developed in Victoria's house. When the fighting ended, when most of the army was destroyed, she emerged and surrendered. She'd never wanted to fight, had been coerced into attacking the Cullens through lies and threats. Carlyle and Esme wanted to save her, wanted to offer her a chance at the vegetarian lifestyle, wanted to show mercy to someone who'd been victimized by Victoria's manipulation. The Cullens argued that Bree was innocent, that she deserved protection rather than execution. But the Volturi arrived before the Cullens could secure Bree's safety. Jane, Alec, and several other guard members appeared, ostensibly to deal with the illegal newborn army, but actually to investigate the Cullens and potentially acquire their gifted members. Jane examined the situation, listened to the Cullens' explanations, observed Bree with cold assessment. The Cullens tried to protect Bree, explained that she'd surrendered peacefully, argued that she posed no threat, but Jane was unmoved. The law was clear. Newborn armies were illegal, and all members of such armies had to be destroyed. There were no exceptions, no mercy for those who'd been coerced or manipulated. Jane gave the order, and Felix tore Bree apart, while the Cullens watched helplessly. Bree's last moments were terror and confusion, calling out for mercy that didn't come, destroyed for violating laws she didn't know existed by joining an army she'd been forced into. The Cullens, particularly Carlyle and Esme, were devastated by their inability to save her. They'd fought to protect this young vampire, had wanted to give her the chance they'd given other damaged newborns in their family. But Volturi law was absolute, and their protests meant nothing in the face of that authority. Victoria and Riley had stayed back from the main battle, observing from a distance. When Victoria saw her army being destroyed, when she recognized that the Cullens would survive and her revenge would fail, she adapted. She sent Riley forward alone, sacrificed him as a distraction, while she tried to reach Bella. Riley died fighting Seth Clearwater, a young shapeshifter who killed him despite Riley's newborn strength. Riley's last moments were confusion and betrayal, realizing too late that Victoria had never loved him, that he'd been a tool rather than a partner, that everything she'd told him was manipulation designed to make him useful. Victoria reached Bella's hiding place and found Edward waiting. The fight between them was desperate and vicious. Edward protecting his mate with absolute commitment, Victoria attacking with grief-fueled rage. Edward was older, more experienced, more skilled, but Victoria's gift for self-preservation made her difficult to catch, difficult to hold, constantly finding escape routes and advantageous positions. The fight might have continued indefinitely, might have gone either way, except that Seth Clearwater arrived after killing Riley. Together, Edward and Seth overwhelmed Victoria, tearing her apart, ending her revenge plot, destroying the last member of James's original coven. The clearing where the main battle occurred was covered in ash, the remains of over 20 newborns and their creators burned to ensure no regeneration. The Cullens had survived, but barely, facing injuries and exhaustion from fighting so many opponents. The alliance with the shapeshifters held through the crisis, but remained fragile, built on temporary need rather than genuine trust. and the Volturi departed with warnings that another situation requiring their intervention would not be forgiven, that the Cullens' unusual lifestyle and their protection of Bella had created problems that could not be allowed to continue. Bree Tanner's death haunted Carlisle and Esme. She'd been 15, transformed against her will, forced into an army, given no choice in any aspect of her short vampire existence. She'd tried to surrender, tried to choose peace, tried to do the right thing, and she'd been destroyed anyway, torn apart and burned because Volturi law allowed no exceptions, showed no mercy to those caught in circumstances beyond their control. Her death represented everything dark about vampire law and vampire society, the absolute nature of Volturi authority, the impossibility of justice in a system based purely on power. The Volturi did not ask for authority over vampire society. They took it, seized it through centuries of calculated violence and strategic brutality that destroyed anyone who challenged them and terrified everyone else into submission. For nearly 3,000 years, they have ruled from Volterra, Italy, an ancient city where they maintain headquarters in tunnels beneath the streets, where they hold court and pass judgment and destroy those who violate their laws. They are not elected. They are not accountable. They are simply the most powerful vampire coven in existence, and their power is absolute because no one has been strong enough to challenge them and survive. The Volturi's rise to power began with the destruction of the Romanian coven, the previous rulers of the vampire world. The Romanians, led by Vladimir and Stefan, had ruled for over 1,000 years before the Volturi emerged as challengers. The Romanian rule was different from what came after. They lived openly among humans in some regions, built massive fortresses, created spectacle and myth, treated mortals as subjects and cattle. They created immortal children as curiosities, maintained vampire armies numbering in the hundreds, demanded worship or inspired terror depending on their mood. They were powerful but careless, visible but vulnerable, dominant but ultimately doomed by their own excess. The Volturi positioned themselves as reformers, vampires who understood that secrecy served their kind better than spectacle. Aro, Caius, and Marcus began gathering allies, recruiting gifted vampires who could provide tactical advantages that would allow them to challenge Romanian dominance. They found Jane and Alec in a medieval village, 2 children being burned at the stake for supposed witchcraft. The villagers had bound them to wooden posts, had lit the fires, had begun the execution that would have killed them within minutes. Aro arrived in time to transform them both, pulling them from the flames just before death claimed them, giving them immortality and binding them to his service through gratitude and necessity. Jane and Alec woke from transformation with gifts born from their trauma. Jane could create the illusion of pain so perfect that victims believed they were burning alive, experiencing the same agony she'd felt at the stake. Alec could remove all sensation, creating a mist that cut victims off from sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, leaving them trapped in absolute nothingness. Together, the twins gave the Volturi offensive capabilities that no other coven could match. Jane could incapacitate dozens of enemies simultaneously, dropping them writhing in illusory agony. Alec could blind and deafen entire groups, leaving them helpless before Volturi attacks. These gifts, combined with others the Volturi collected, made them nearly invincible. The war between the Romanians and the Volturi spanned decades, and destroyed covens across Europe. Vampires were forced to choose sides, to ally with the old rulers or the new challengers, to risk destruction regardless of which choice they made. The Volturi framed their rebellion as necessary, as protecting vampires from human discovery and retaliation that Romanian excess would inevitably provoke. Some covens believed this reasoning. Others simply recognized which side would win and chose accordingly. The conflict created carnage on a scale vampire society had never seen before, and hasn't seen since. Thousands of vampires were destroyed, torn apart and burned in battles that raged across territories. The decisive confrontation came when the Volturi's accumulated gifts overwhelmed the Romanians' numerical advantage. Jane and Alec disabled entire groups of Romanian soldiers simultaneously. Chelsea, another gifted vampire the Volturi had recruited, broke the loyalty bonds that held Romanian allies together, causing defections and destroying morale. Dimitri tracked Romanian leaders who tried to flee, ensuring none escaped to rebuild. The Volturi destroyed the Romanian armies methodically, burned their fortresses, executed their supporters. Vladimir and Stefan, the Romanian leaders, escaped only through desperate flight, hiding while their empire burned around them. They've nursed their hatred for 3,000 years since, waiting for any opportunity to witness the Volturi's destruction. Having seized power, the Volturi needed to maintain it. They did this through a combination of useful laws that genuinely served vampire interests and self-serving enforcement that consolidated their authority. The foundation of Volturi law is secrecy. Vampires must remain hidden from human awareness. This law serves practical purposes, preventing organized human resistance, allowing vampires to hunt without interference, protecting the vampire world from the chaos that exposure would bring. But it also serves the Volturi's interests by preventing other vampires from building the kind of open power bases that the Romanians once held. Any vampire who threatens exposure, who creates patterns of death too obvious to ignore, who acts carelessly enough to draw human attention, faces destruction. The Volturi enforce their laws through the Guard, through gifted vampires whose abilities make resistance nearly futile. Jane's pain illusions can drop the strongest vampire instantly, leaving them helpless and writhing. Alec's sensory deprivation mist removes all ability to perceive or respond to threats. Chelsea manipulates emotional bonds, ensuring loyalty within the Guard and breaking apart alliances that might threaten Volturi power. Renata provides a physical shield around Aro, making it nearly impossible to approach him with hostile intent. Dimitri tracks anyone anywhere, making escape from Volturi judgment impossible once they decide to find you. These gifts, combined with the physical strength of Guard members like Felix, make the Volturi capable of destroying any vampire or coven that defies them. But the Volturi's enforcement is not impartial or just. They overlook violations when it suits them, delay punishment for strategic reasons, use accusations of law-breaking as pretext for eliminating covens they perceive as threats. The laws are tools for maintaining power as much as genuine attempts at governing vampire society. When the Cullens were accused of creating an immortal child, the Volturi came not primarily to enforce that law, but because they saw an opportunity to acquire Alice, Edward, and Bella's gifts for their Guard. The immortal child accusation provided perfect justification, an unambiguous violation that would allow them to destroy the Cullens and claim their gifted members without appearing tyrannical. Aro leads the Volturi through his gift and his ambition. He possesses tactile telepathy, able to see every thought a person has ever had through a single touch. This gift makes him an effective judge, able to know with absolute certainty whether laws have been broken, whether accused vampires are guilty, whether threats are real or imagined. But it also makes him paranoid, constantly seeking to touch potential rivals, to verify through direct mental contact that they pose no danger to his power. He collects gifted vampires obsessively, wanting their abilities added to the guard's arsenal, unwilling to allow powerful gifts to exist outside his control. When gifted vampires refuse his invitation to join the guard, he often destroys them, eliminating potential threats rather than allowing them to live independently. Caius is the most cruel of the three founding members, taking genuine pleasure in punishment and destruction. Where Aro at least pretends to regret necessary violence, Caius embraces it. He views humans as prey and nothing more, sees vampire law primarily as a tool to maintain vampire superiority over the human world. He argues consistently for harsh punishment, for destruction rather than mercy, for making examples of lawbreakers through excessive violence. His voice in Volturi deliberations is the one that pushes toward brutality, toward treating any violation as deserving death, toward using fear as the primary tool of governance. Marcus is perhaps the most tragic of the Volturi's leaders. He possesses the gift of seeing relationships, able to perceive the emotional bonds between people, to know who loves whom, who is loyal to whom, who might betray whom. This gift once brought him joy, allowing him to see the beauty of connection and love throughout vampire society. But his mate Didim died thousands of years ago, and her death broke something in Marcus that has never healed. There are heavy implications that Aro killed his own sister, killed Didim to prevent Marcus from leaving the Volturi, to keep Marcus's gift available for their use. Whether this is true or not, Marcus exists in profound depression, caring about nothing, waiting for death, but unable to achieve it. Chelsea uses her gift to keep Marcus bound to the Volturi, artificially maintaining loyalty that would otherwise have dissolved with Didym's death. Without this manipulation, Marcus would simply walk away, would abandon power and politics and all the concerns that occupied him when his mate lived. The fact that he requires this artificial loyalty demonstrates how completely the mate bond can define a vampire's existence. Without Didim, Marcus has no natural connection to anything or anyone. He exists but does not live, continues but does not care, functions as a shell animated only by Chelsea's gift and the inability to achieve the death he desires. The Volturi's methods of enforcement are designed to inspire terror as much as to punish actual violations. When they discover lawbreakers, they don't simply execute them quietly. They make spectacles of destruction, ensure that other vampires witness or hear about the fate of those who defy Volturi authority. They destroy not just the guilty, but everyone connected to violations, everyone who knew and didn't report, everyone who might have helped or hidden lawbreakers. This collective punishment ensures that vampires police each other. That fear of being associated with violations prevents communities from forming that might challenge Volturi power. The destruction of immortal children exemplifies Volturi brutality. When they discover an immortal child, they destroy it along with everyone who knew about it. The creators die. Those who helped create or hide the child die. Witnesses who knew but didn't report it die. The Volturi show no mercy because they believe mercy in these cases threatens all vampires. Because one immortal child allowed to exist could expose the vampire world through the trail of death it creates. But the enforcement is absolute beyond what necessity requires, destroying entire covens for the actions of one or two members, ensuring that the price of this particular violation is so high that no vampire would ever risk it. The Denali sisters watched their daughter burn 1,000 years ago, forced to witness her destruction while knowing they were responsible for creating her and for the hundreds of deaths she caused. The trauma shaped their entire existence afterward, drove them to adopt Carlyle's vegetarian lifestyle as penance, made them desperate to atone for what they'd done. But the Volturi showed them no compassion during that execution, no recognition of their genuine grief or their ignorance of the law they'd broken. The child was torn apart and burned while screaming for her mothers, and the sisters were left alive to carry that memory forever, punishment arguably worse than destruction. Irina's execution centuries later demonstrated that the Volturi's cruelty extends even to mistakes made in good faith. Irina saw Renesmee from a distance, believed she was witnessing an immortal child, reported what she saw to prevent the tragedy her own coven had experienced. When the Volturi discovered Renesmee was actually a hybrid rather than an immortal child, that Irina's report was mistaken rather than malicious, they destroyed Irina anyway. Caius argued she'd wasted their time with false accusations, that bearing false witness deserved death regardless of intent. Aro agreed, and Irina was torn apart and burned while her sisters Tanya and Kate watched, forced to witness another execution, another member of their family destroyed by Volturi judgment. The confrontation between the Cullens and the Volturi revealed the limits of Volturi power, while also demonstrating their willingness to use any pretext for eliminating threats. The Volturi arrived in force, bringing their entire guard, prepared for battle based on Irina's report of an immortal child. But Renesmee wasn't an immortal child. She was a hybrid, capable of growth and control in ways that immortal children never could. The distinction was crucial, the difference between violating the law and doing something unprecedented, but not actually illegal. The Volturi, frustrated that their pretext had evaporated, searched for other justifications to attack, other reasons to destroy the Cullens and acquire their gifted members. But the Cullens had gathered witnesses, vampires from covens around the world, who came to testify that Renesmee posed no threat, that she wasn't an immortal child, that the Cullens had broken no laws. The gathered covens represented power that even the Volturi had to acknowledge. Enough gifted vampires and experienced fighters that attacking the Cullens would cost the Volturi dearly, even if they won. Bella's shield could protect against Jane and Alec's gifts. Benjamin's elemental control could create chaos on the battlefield. Zafrina's illusions could disorient the guard. The combined strength of the witnesses created a situation where Volturi victory, while likely, would come at a cost the Volturi weren't willing to pay. So the Volturi withdrew, claimed they were satisfied that no law had been broken, departed without the battle they'd prepared for. But their retreat was pragmatic rather than just, based on calculation of costs versus benefits, rather than recognition that they'd been wronged. They left with implicit threats. warnings that another situation requiring their intervention would not be forgiven, that the Cullens' unusual lifestyle and protection of Bella had created problems that could not be allowed to continue. The confrontation ended without violence, but it didn't end the threat. The Volturi remained in power, their authority questioned but not broken, their methods unchanged, their willingness to use any pretext for eliminating perceived threats as strong as ever. The Volturi's reign of terror has lasted 3,000 years because they've been willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain power. They've destroyed thousands of vampires, broken apart covens, created laws that serve their interests while claiming to serve vampire society. They've used fear as their primary tool of governance, ensuring that vampires throughout the world know that defying Volturi authority means death, that associating with lawbreakers means death, that even honest mistakes can result in execution if the Volturi decide mercy is inconvenient. They are not evil in the sense of seeking suffering for its own sake. They are evil in the sense of valuing power above everything, of treating other vampires as tools or threats, rather than individuals deserving of justice or compassion. The future of Volturi power remains uncertain after their confrontation with the Cullens. For the first time in millennia, their authority was questioned successfully, their invincibility revealed as conditional rather than absolute. Other covens witnessed the standoff, saw that gathering enough strength could check Volturi power, learned that resistance was possible even if dangerous. Whether this leads to more challenges against Volturi authority, to the formation of alliances that might eventually overthrow them, or simply to more brutal enforcement as the Volturi respond to this threat against their dominance, remains to be seen. But the confrontation changed something fundamental. The Volturi's reign of terror continues, but it continues with the knowledge that terror alone may no longer be sufficient to maintain their power forever. Edward Cullen existed as a vampire for 90 years before he met Bella Swan, and for most of those years he believed himself damned. Carlyle had saved him from Spanish influenza in 1918, had transformed him to preserve his life when death was certain. Edward woke to vampire existence with Carlyle as his guide, with the vegetarian philosophy presented to him as the only acceptable way to live. For 10 years, Edward followed that philosophy, drank only animal blood, maintained control over the thirst that demanded human prey. But in 1928, something in him broke. The constant denial of his nature, the endless struggle against instinct, the philosophical questions about whether vampires were capable of goodness or were simply monsters pretending at morality, all of it became too much. Edward left Carlyle to hunt humans, convincing himself he could make his killing moral through careful selection of victims. The justification Edward constructed was elegant in its logic and horrifying in its implications. He would use his telepathy to read thoughts, to identify criminals, to confirm guilt before he killed. He would hunt only murderers, rapists, abusers, people whose crimes deserved death by any reasonable moral standard. He wasn't simply feeding on innocent humans. He was acting as judge and executioner, removing dangerous people from the world, making his kills serve justice rather than just satisfying his thirst. The rationalization allowed him to hunt humans while maintaining the belief that he was different from other vampires, that his killing served a greater purpose beyond simple predation. For 10 years, Edward hunted this way. He would move through human populations reading thoughts, listening to the mental chatter of everyone around him, searching for minds that revealed criminal intent or guilty memories. When he found someone whose thoughts confirmed they'd committed terrible crimes, he would follow them, would track them until opportunity presented itself, would kill them and drink their blood. He told himself he was making the world better, that each person he killed was someone who would have hurt others, that his victims deserved their fate. The logic seemed sound, the philosophy defensible, the compromise between his nature and his morality sustainable. The methodology was systematic and cold. Edward would identify potential victims through their thoughts, would listen for memories of crimes committed, for plans to commit future violence, for the psychological patterns that marked predators and killers. He became expert at recognizing guilt, at distinguishing between intrusive thoughts that humans sometimes experienced and genuine intent to harm. He developed criteria for who deserved death, what crimes were serious enough to warrant execution, how certain he needed to be before he acted as executioner. The elaborate system made him feel methodical rather than monstrous, made the killing seem reasoned rather than instinctive. But the telepathy that allowed Edward to identify criminals also forced him to know them intimately before he killed them. He didn't simply read their guilty thoughts and move to execution. He heard everything. Their memories of crimes, yes, but also their regrets, their rationalizations, their fears, their loves, their humanity existing alongside their guilt. He heard the murderer's love for his daughter, the rapist's memory of his own childhood abuse, the abuser's desperate belief that he was teaching necessary lessons. Edward knew his victims as complete people rather than abstract concepts of evil, and that knowledge made killing them worse rather than better. The complexity of human psychology revealed itself through Edward's gift in ways that undermined his simple categorization of people as deserving death. He encountered a man who'd killed his wife's abuser, whose crime was murder, but whose motivation was protection. He found a woman who drowned her children during a psychotic episode, whose guilt was legal, but whose mental illness complicated moral judgment. He hunted people whose crimes were clear, but whose circumstances raised questions about culpability, about free will, about whether anyone truly deserved the death Edward delivered. But he killed them anyway, drank their blood, satisfied his thirst while telling himself he was different from vampires who killed indiscriminately. The perfect memory that all vampires possess ensured that Edward couldn't forget any of it. Every victim was preserved in crystalline clarity forever. Every face, every thought, every final moment of fear and confusion and death remained accessible, vivid, impossible to diminish with time. Edward remembered the man who'd murdered his business partner, remembered his thoughts as Edward hunted him, remembered his realization that something was stalking him, remembered his terror as Edward attacked, remembered the taste of his blood and the feeling of his life ending. Edward remembered hundreds of these deaths, hundreds of people he judged and executed, hundreds of moments when he'd acted as predator while telling himself he was acting as justice. The psychological weight of these memories accumulated over the 10 years of Edward's rebellion. Each kill added to the burden. Each victim's thoughts added to the chorus of voices he carried in his mind. The telepathy that made his hunting methodology possible also ensured he could never achieve the emotional distance that might have made the killing bearable. Other vampires who hunted humans could view their prey as simply food, could disconnect emotionally from the act of killing. Edward couldn't. He knew his victims intimately. He understood them completely, and he killed them anyway, convinced himself their crimes justified their deaths, maintained his rationalization, even as the weight of what he was doing crushed him slowly. The specific memories that haunted Edward were numerous and varied. He remembered hunting a man in Chicago who killed 3 women, remembered reading his thoughts and finding not remorse but satisfaction, remembered feeling justified in ending him. He remembered the kill itself, the moment when the man realized he was being hunted, the fear that flooded his mind, the desperate attempt to flee that failed because human speed could never outrun vampire pursuit. Edward remembered the taste of his blood, the satisfaction of the thirst being quenched, the moment after feeding when clarity returned and he had to face what he'd done. He remembered walking away from the body, leaving it to be discovered, creating another mysterious death that would confuse human authorities. He remembered hunting in New York, in Los Angeles, in smaller cities and towns across the country. He remembered reading the thoughts of a serial rapist and following him for weeks, learning his patterns, understanding his psychology completely before finally killing him in an alley. He remembered the man's final thoughts, his confusion about what was attacking him, his terror as Edward's strength overwhelmed him. Edward remembered feeling righteous in that moment, convinced that he was protecting future victims, that this death served a purpose beyond his own needs. But he also remembered the man's earlier thoughts about his own daughter, his love for her mixed with his crimes against others, the complexity that made simple moral judgment impossible. The realization that his justifications were hollow came gradually rather than suddenly. Edward began recognizing patterns in his own thinking, seeing how he'd constructed elaborate moral frameworks to excuse what was ultimately just killing for blood. He was choosing who lived and who died based on his interpretation of their thoughts, his judgment of their guilt, his assessment of whether they deserved execution. But he wasn't a legitimate judge. He had no authority beyond his own power and his own moral certainty. The people he killed hadn't been tried, hadn't been convicted, hadn't been given any opportunity to defend themselves or seek redemption. He was simply killing them because he could, because their blood satisfied his thirst, because his telepathy gave him the excuse he needed to feel righteous about murder. The breaking point came when Edward recognized that he was no better than his victims, that the moral superiority he'd claimed was fiction, that he'd become exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. He was a killer. The fact that his victims were also killers didn't change his nature. The fact that he could justify his actions through elaborate philosophy didn't make those actions less monstrous. He'd spent 10 years drinking human blood, ending human lives, convincing himself he was different from other vampires, when the only real difference was the elaborate rationalization he'd constructed around his killing. Edward returned to Carlisle in 1933, broken and disgusted by what he'd become. He confessed everything, detailed his decade of hunting humans, explained his justifications and his growing recognition that those justifications were meaningless. Carlyle accepted him without judgment, welcomed him back without recrimination, helped him return to the vegetarian lifestyle he'd abandoned. But Carlyle's forgiveness, while genuine, couldn't erase Edward's memories. The perfect clarity of vampire memory meant that every kill from his rebellious period remained as vivid as the day it happened. Edward would carry those deaths forward into eternity, would remember every victim forever, would never be granted the mercy of fading recollection or diminishing guilt. The self-hatred that followed Edward's return to the Cullens shaped his entire existence for the next 70 years. He viewed himself as damned, believed his soul was lost, saw himself as a monster pretending to be civilized. The vegetarian lifestyle he maintained wasn't redemption. It was simply damage control, an attempt to stop adding to the list of deaths he'd caused. He didn't believe he could be good. He simply tried to avoid being worse than he already was. This self-perception colored everything, made him isolated within his own family, made him believe he deserved eternal loneliness as punishment for what he'd done. Edward's isolation was partly self-imposed and partly the inevitable result of his gift. The telepathy that had made his hunting methodology possible also made normal relationships difficult. He heard everyone's thoughts constantly, knew what they were thinking before they spoke, understood their hidden feelings and unspoken judgments. This created distance even with the Cullens, even with the family who loved him and accepted him despite his past. He knew what they thought about him, knew their concerns and their pity and their occasional fear when he struggled with control. The knowledge made genuine intimacy difficult because nothing was ever truly private, because he couldn't experience the mystery and discovery that normal relationships provided. The decades between his return to Carlisle and his meeting with Bella were characterized by emptiness and waiting for nothing. Edward went through the motions of vampire existence. He attended high school repeatedly, enduring the monotony of classes he'd taken dozens of times. He pursued interests, learned to play piano with extraordinary skill, composed music that reflected his long existence and his vampire perspective. He hunted animals to satisfy his thirst, maintained perfect control, never allowed himself to slip back toward human blood despite the constant temptation. But none of it brought joy or satisfaction or meaning. He simply continued existing because existence was what vampires did, because he couldn't achieve the death he sometimes believed he deserved. When Edward met Bella Swan in 2005, when he first caught her scent in the biology classroom at Forks High School, every aspect of his century of darkness converged into a single moment of terrible temptation. Her blood called to him more strongly than any other humans ever had. The scent was overwhelming, perfect, designed specifically to appeal to his thirst. His vampire instincts screamed at him to kill her, to drain her, to satisfy the burning in his throat with the blood that smelled like exactly what he needed. He came closer to losing control in that moment than he had in the 70 years since returning to Carlisle's vegetarian lifestyle. Edward gripped the edge of the table, stopped breathing entirely to avoid her scent, planned out in his mind how he would kill everyone in the classroom to eliminate witnesses before he killed her. Edward fled from that classroom, left school entirely, drove away from Forks planning never to return. He recognized the danger Bella represented, understood that being near her meant risking her life constantly, knew that his nature made him her predator regardless of how much control he developed over decades. But he also recognized something else in that moment of temptation. He wanted to know her. The same telepathy that made him dangerous to her also revealed that her mind was silent to him, completely impenetrable. The first person he'd encountered whose thoughts he couldn't read. The mystery of her, the challenge she represented, the fact that she was the one person he'd met in 90 years whose inner life was private from him. All of it drew him back despite the danger. The relationship that developed between Edward and Bella was built on his constant awareness that he could kill her at any moment. Every touch risked breaking her fragile human body. Every kiss meant tasting her blood on her lips and fighting the instinct to drink deeper. Every intimate moment was a battle between love and thirst, between his desire to protect her and his nature as her predator. The decades of control Edward had developed, the 70 years of maintaining the vegetarian lifestyle, all of it was tested constantly by Bella's presence. She was the ultimate temptation, the perfect victim, the one person whose blood cooled to him more strongly than anyone else's. But Edward's darkness extended beyond simple thirst. His century of self-hatred and his conviction that he was damned made him view the relationship as fundamentally wrong from the beginning. He believed he was putting Bella in danger, not just physically, but spiritually. That association with him would corrupt her. That loving him was a mistake she was making out of ignorance of what he truly was. He tried to control her movements, to limit her exposure to danger, to make decisions about her safety without her input. The behavior was controlling, born from love but expressing itself through domination, treating Bella as something to be protected rather than someone capable of making her own choices. The decision to leave Bella in New Moon represented Edward's darkness at its most destructive. He convinced himself that she would be better off without him, that removing himself from her life would give her the chance at the normal human existence that she deserved. He told her he didn't love her anymore, lied to her face, tried to make the separation clean and final. Then he disappeared, taking his entire family with him, leaving Bella alone with her grief and confusion. Edward believed he was protecting her through this abandonment, that his absence was a gift rather than a betrayal. But the effect on Bella was devastating. She fell into depression, became reckless, nearly destroyed herself trying to hear his voice through dangerous situations. The months after Edward left Bella were empty in ways that his previous decades of isolation hadn't been. He'd experienced loneliness before, had spent years believing he deserved solitude as punishment for his rebellious period. But losing Bella was different. He'd found someone who made existence meaningful, who gave him purpose beyond simply maintaining control and avoiding killing. Leaving her felt like dying slowly, like experiencing every moment of loss and grief that his vampire nature usually protected him from. When he believed she was dead, when Alice had a vision that suggested Bella had committed suicide, Edward's response was immediate and absolute. He traveled to Italy to provoke the Volturi into destroying him, choosing death over existence in a world without Bella. The suicide attempt revealed the depth of Edward's darkness and the extent to which Bella had become his reason for continuing to exist. For 90 years, he'd believed himself damned, but had continued living because he couldn't achieve death through normal means and wouldn't actively seek it. But Bella's apparent death changed that calculation. Without her, existence lost whatever meaning it had gained. Edward sought destruction deliberately, walking into Volturi territory planning to force their hand, prepared to die if Bella was truly gone. Only her arrival, her proof that she was alive, prevented his execution. The Volturi let him leave with warnings and implicit threats, but Edward had revealed his willingness to die, had demonstrated that his existence was now conditional on Bella's survival. The pregnancy crisis during Breaking Dawn brought all of Edward's darkness back to the surface. When Bella became pregnant with Renesmee, when the hybrid child began growing inside her with supernatural speed and strength, Edward viewed the pregnancy as a monster killing the woman he loved. He saw Renesmee not as his daughter, but as a thing destroying Bella from the inside. He begged Bella to abort, offered every argument he could construct, was willing to destroy his own child to save his mate. The choice demonstrated how completely Bella had become the center of his existence, how her survival mattered more to him than anything else, even their child. The birth was violence and desperation, Edward using his teeth to cut Bella free when the hybrid baby broke through her body, performing an emergency delivery that saved Renesmee, but left Bella dying. Edward injected venom directly into Bella's heart, flooded her system desperately, transformed her to save her life when she'd lost too much blood to survive as human. The transformation he'd avoided giving her for years, the change he'd resisted because he didn't want to take her humanity, became the only way to keep her alive. Edward gave her immortality not as a gift, but as the price of her survival, transforming her because the alternative was watching her die. Edward's century of darkness, his rebellious period and his decades of self-hatred and his century of believing himself damned, all of it shaped how he loved Bella and what he was willing to do for her. He'd killed humans and carried perfect memory of those deaths. He'd isolated himself from meaningful relationships because his telepathy made intimacy difficult. He'd viewed himself as a monster pretending at civilization, as something irredeemably corrupted despite Carlyle's insistence that vampires retain their souls and moral capacity. But Bella saw something different in him, saw someone worth loving despite his nature, saw choice and goodness existing alongside darkness and violence. The transformation that finally made Bella his equal, that allowed her to experience the mate bond with full vampire intensity rather than limited human capacity, changed Edward's relationship with his own darkness. He was still the vampire who'd killed humans during his rebellious period. He still carried perfect memory of every victim. He was still capable of the violence and predation that defined vampire nature. But Bella's choice to love him anyway, to join him in immortality knowing what he was and what he'd done, suggested that perhaps redemption was possible even for vampires, that perhaps choice mattered more than nature, that perhaps his century of darkness didn't define him completely or permanently. Rosalie Hale was 18 years old in 1933, living in Rochester, New York, believing she had everything a young woman of her time and social class could want. She was beautiful, extraordinarily so, the kind of beauty that turned heads and stopped conversations when she entered the room. She came from a wealthy family, wore expensive clothes, attended the right parties, moved in circles where privilege and appearance determined worth. She was engaged to Royce King II, son of the man who owned the bank where her father worked. The engagement represented everything her parents had wanted for her, everything society told her she should want for herself. Marriage to Royce would secure her position, would give her wealth and status, and the life of comfort that beautiful women from good families were supposed to desire. But Rosalie's perfect life was built on appearances and assumptions rather than genuine connection or understanding. Royce valued her beauty the way someone might value an expensive possession, something that reflected well on him, that other men would envy him for possessing. He was attentive in public, careful to display their relationship prominently, ensuring everyone saw that he'd captured the most beautiful woman in Rochester. But in private moments, Rosalie began recognizing something cold in him, something that viewed her as an object rather than a person. She ignored these warning signs, convinced herself that marriage would be good, that her doubts were simply nervousness about the approaching wedding, that everything would be fine once they were actually married. The night of April 7th, 1933, destroyed every assumption Rosalie had made about her life and her future. She'd been visiting her friend Vera, had spent the evening with Vera's new baby, had felt something close to envy watching her friend with a child. Vera had married for love rather than status, had chosen a man who worked as a carpenter rather than someone wealthy. But Vera seemed happy in ways that Rosalie was beginning to recognize she wasn't, satisfied with a life that looked nothing like what Rosalie had been raised to want. Walking home that evening, Rosalie thought about these differences, wondered if perhaps she'd made mistakes in her choices, questioned whether the perfect life she'd constructed was actually what she wanted. Royce was on the street with several of his friends, all of them drunk, celebrating something Rosalie didn't understand and would never have the chance to ask about. He called to her, wanted to show her off to his friends, wanted them to see the beautiful woman he was going to marry. Rosalie approached, uncomfortable but not yet frightened, aware that Royce had been drinking but not yet understanding the danger that represented. Royce put his hands on her, pulled her close, displayed her to his friends like a trophy. His friends made comments about her beauty, about Royce's good fortune, about what Royce would get to do once they were married. The conversation made Rosalie uncomfortable, made her recognize how these men viewed her, but she still didn't understand what was about to happen. The assault began when one of Royce's friends made a crude comment, and Royce responded by demonstrating that Rosalie belonged to him, that he could do whatever he wanted with his possession. He kissed her roughly, his hands moving in ways they never had before, his drunkenness making him aggressive and careless. Rosalie tried to pull away, tried to say no, tried to assert boundaries that she'd never had to defend before. But Royce was stronger, and his friends were there, and the alcohol had destroyed whatever restraint he normally maintained. What began as unwanted touching escalated quickly into violence, into violation, into trauma that would mark Rosalie permanently, even though her body would eventually be transformed and healed. The details of what happened that night are not necessary to recount fully. Rosalie was brutally beaten and raped by Royce and his friends, violated repeatedly while they laughed and made jokes, treated as an object to be used rather than a person experiencing suffering. The physical pain was overwhelming, the violation absolute, the betrayal devastating. This was the man she'd been planning to marry, The man her parents had celebrated as the perfect match. The man who was supposed to love and protect her. Instead, he destroyed her, used her body for his entertainment, demonstrated with absolute clarity that he'd never seen her as a person at all. She was simply a beautiful thing he wanted to own, and the assault was his way of claiming ownership before their marriage made it official. When Royce and his friends finished with her, they left her dying in the street. It was April, still cold in Rochester, and Rosalie lay bleeding in the darkness, her expensive clothes torn and stained, her body broken in ways she couldn't fully process. She couldn't move, couldn't call for help, couldn't do anything except lie there feeling her life drain away. Part of her wanted to die, wanted the pain and violation to end, wanted to escape from what had been done to her. But part of her was furious, consumed by rage at Royce and his friends, at the injustice of dying like this, at the fact that they would face no consequences for what they'd done. Carlisle Cullen found her in the street hours later. He'd been working at a hospital in Rochester, had been walking home in the early morning hours when he came upon her body. Rosalie was barely alive, her heart beating weakly, her breathing shallow. Carlisle could smell the blood, could feel the thirst rising in response, but his centuries of control held firm. He recognized her, had seen her around the city, had noticed her beauty the way everyone noticed Rosalie's beauty. He made a decision in seconds that would reshape her existence forever. He carried her carefully through the city, moving at vampire speed, but taking care not to spill any of her blood, taking her to his home where he could transform her in private. Carlisle's motivation for transforming Rosalie was complicated. He acted partly from compassion, unable to let her die when he had the power to save her. But he also hoped she might become a companion for Edward, that Edward might find in her what Carlisle had found in Esme. The hope was misguided, based on the false assumption that beauty and similar age would create connection. But in the moment, Carlisle believed he was giving Rosalie life and potentially giving Edward the mate bond that would end his isolation. Neither outcome would manifest as Carlisle intended. Rosalie endured the 3 days of transformation while still processing the trauma of her assault. The burning pain of venom spreading through her body combined with the physical and psychological pain of what Royce had done to her. She couldn't separate the agony of transformation from the agony of violation, couldn't distinguish between the pain of dying and the pain of being reborn. When she woke, when the transformation was complete, her first emotion wasn't gratitude or wonder, it was rage. Rage at what had been done to her. Rage at being transformed without her consent. Rage at Carlisle for making this choice for her when she would have preferred death. Waking as a vampire, Rosalie discovered that her beauty had been perfected, enhanced, made supernatural. The appearance that had made her a target for Royce's violence was now eternal, frozen at 18, impossibly flawless. She'd been transformed into the most beautiful vampire in existence. Beauty so extreme it was almost painful to witness. But this perfection felt like a curse rather than a gift. The beauty had made her a victim. Now it was permanent, unchangeable, a constant reminder of what had made Royce want to possess her in the first place. Carlisle explained what she was, what had been done to her, what her new existence would entail. He explained the vegetarian lifestyle, the choice to drink only animal blood the commitment to valuing human life. But Rosalie didn't care about philosophy or morality in those first moments. She cared about revenge. She wanted Royce and his friends dead. She wanted them to pay for what they'd done. The transformation had given her the power to achieve that revenge, had made her stronger than any of them, fast enough to catch them, durable enough that they couldn't hurt her. The monster they created through their violence now had the tools to destroy them. But Carlyle asked her to wait, to learn control first, to understand her new nature before she acted. Rosalie agreed, not because she accepted his philosophy, but because she recognized the practical necessity. She needed to control her strength, needed to learn how to function as a vampire, needed to avoid drawing attention that might interfere with her revenge. She learned quickly, motivated by fury rather than by any desire to embrace her new existence. She developed control not because she valued human life, but because losing control might prevent her from killing the specific humans she wanted dead. The revenge Rosalie planned was methodical and deliberate. She would kill each of Royce's friends individually, save Royce for last, make them all pay for what they'd done. She waited, watched, learned their patterns and habits. Then she began hunting them, using her vampire abilities to become the predator rather than the victim. She appeared to each one beautiful and vulnerable, the same appearance that had made her a target. But when they approached, when they tried to touch her, she killed them. Not quickly, not mercifully. She made them suffer, made them feel fear and pain and helplessness, made them experience something approximating what they'd made her experience. But Rosalie didn't drink their blood. This was important to her, a distinction that mattered even in her rage. She wasn't killing them to satisfy vampire thirst. She was killing them for justice, for revenge, for punishment. Drinking their blood would have made the killing about her needs rather than about their crimes. She wanted them dead, wanted them destroyed, but she didn't want to consume them, didn't want any part of them inside her. So she killed them and left their bodies, created mysterious deaths that would confuse human authorities, but would be clearly murders rather than accidents. Royce was the last, saved deliberately, forced to live with fear as his friends died mysteriously one by one. Rosalie appeared to him wearing a wedding dress, the same dress she would have worn to their wedding if he hadn't destroyed that future. She wanted him to see her, to recognize her, to understand who was killing him and why. Royce's reaction was terror and confusion, seeing the woman he'd assaulted and left for dead now standing before him impossibly beautiful and clearly supernatural. He tried to run, tried to fight, tried to beg. Rosalie granted him none of these mercies. She killed him, slowly, made him suffer, made him understand that this was payment for what he'd done to her. But when Royce was dead, when all of them were dead, Rosalie felt no satisfaction. The revenge she'd planned and executed hadn't healed anything, hadn't undone the violation, hadn't restored what had been taken from her. She was still a vampire, still transformed without her consent, still trapped in immortality when she'd wanted a human life with human choices. The men who'd assaulted her were dead, but that death hadn't given her back what she'd lost. She couldn't have the marriage she'd wanted, couldn't have children, couldn't age alongside a human partner, couldn't experience any of the normal human milestones that she'd been raised to expect and desire. Rosalie's bitterness after her revenge was complete became a defining characteristic of her personality. She resented her transformation despite understanding that the alternative was death. She envied humans their mortality and their choices, their ability to have children and grow old and experience life in ways that vampires couldn't. She was particularly bitter about the inability to have children, about the fact that vampire bodies were frozen and sterile, about watching human women experience pregnancy and motherhood while she was permanently barred from that experience. This resentment colored everything, made her hard and cold, focused on losses rather than gains. When Rosalie found Emmett being mauled by a bear in 1935, when she recognized him as her mate the moment she saw him, something in her began to shift. She carried him over 100 miles to Carlisle, controlling her thirst despite being a young vampire, motivated by the maid bond to save him rather than drain him. She asked Carlisle to transform him, and when Emmett woke, the bond formed for him as it had for her. Emmett gave Rosalie something she'd believed impossible after her assault and transformation. He gave her love without violation, connection without objectification, a relationship where she was valued as a person rather than as a beautiful possession. But even Emmett's love couldn't erase Rosalie's trauma or her resentment about what vampirism had cost her. She remained the most resistant to Bella's desire for transformation, unable to understand why anyone would choose immortality when they had the option of human life. Rosalie saw in Bella the possibility for everything she'd lost: marriage, children, aging, normal human experience. She couldn't comprehend why Bella would voluntarily give up these possibilities for Edward's sake. The incomprehension was rooted in Rosalie's own experience, in the fact that her transformation had been forced rather than chosen, in the fact that she'd never stopped mourning the human life that had been stolen from her. Rosalie's story is one of victimization followed by power, of trauma that couldn't be healed through revenge, of beauty that was simultaneously her greatest asset and the source of her greatest suffering. She was assaulted because she was beautiful, transformed because Carlisle saw her dying and wanted to save her, made eternally beautiful through that transformation. But the beauty that everyone envied was for Rosalie, a permanent reminder of what had been taken from her, of the violation that had led to her transformation, of the normal life she'd wanted and would never have. Her darkness was different from Edward's guilt or Jasper's trauma. It was the darkness of loss, of permanent mourning for a future that had been destroyed, of resentment at being saved into a life she'd never wanted and could never escape. The darkness we've explored tonight lives beneath every moment of Twilight's romance, woven through every choice and every consequence. The transformation is agony that lasts 3 days and echoes through eternity. The immortal children burn while their creators watch helplessly. The Southern Wars turn humans into weapons and then into ash. James hunts with sadistic pleasure until Edward tears him apart in a ballet studio soaked with Bella's blood. Victoria creates an army of disposable soldiers, and Bree dies begging for mercy that never comes. The Volturi rule through terror, destroying Arena for an honest mistake, collecting gifted vampires through coercion, maintaining power through 3,000 years of calculated cruelty. Edward carries perfect memory of every human he killed during his decade of justified murder. Rosalie wakes from transformation and brutal assault to find her beauty perfected and her humanity stolen. This is the cost of forever. This is the weight of immortality. This is the darkness that the Cullens choose to transcend through daily acts of impossible restraint. So rest now, my dreamers, with these truths settled around you like shadows, where even in darkness choice remains, and sleep finds you at last.